Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us here on The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Bill Hayes, author of Sweat, A History of Exercise, published by Bloomsbury and just released last month. Bill's also the author of several books, Sleep Demons, How We Live Now, Insomniac City, and The Anatomist. He contributes frequently to the New York Times. His writing has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Guardian, amongst others. As partner of the late Dr. Oliver Sacks, his essays have appeared in Dr. Sacks's work, as well as in other collections. And he's curated, which is still ongoing, Dr. Sacks's posthumous work. And he's creative director of the Oliver Sacks Foundation. And as you go through a Google search, which maybe you will, you can look at some of his excellent photographs of the people in New York, which have been published in How New York Breaks Your Heart. And Sweat is a book that chronicles the history of exercise from the ancient Greeks to the present world and our companion, the pandemic. But it's funny because we visit with Galen and Jane Fonda. We deal with Kafka and Muhammad Ali, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Jim Fix. So that's funny and fascinating, and how sweat permeates our body and our society. And exercise is perceived today similarly to the ancients and completely differently than the ancients. Why and how we sweat is the thread that weaves its way throughout the book and gives an anchor to the more, I guess, quotidian exercise that's a vocation for some, an addiction for others, and simply an onerous task for perhaps the majority. So Bill, thanks so much for joining us today to talk about the book.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So as a bookseller, I always like to begin at the beginning. And the beginning, as people will walk into my shop, is the cover and title, and the cover primarily. And yours is an excellent cover. And if you have the book there, can you hold it up?
Yeah.
So it does draw you to it. And as I've seen in the past, the colors, the font, but the background photograph is of, and I assume it's Greeks, two Greeks wrestling, correct?
Well, it's actually an Italian painting from the 16th century, a painter I had not known about. And 16th century figures prominently in Sweat, at least in the historical narrative, as I'm sure we'll talk about, with a figure called Girolamo Mercuriale. So yeah, it's an Italian painting, probably of two Greek wrestlers. They had a great interest in ancient Greece and antiquity at that time, during the Renaissance, of course.
Well, since you mentioned his name, it's like dropping the other shoe. Let's talk a little bit about Mercuriale and the fascinating story of how you discovered him, and you might not have ever discovered him at all.
Yeah, I mean, the idea for this book, for Sweat, first came to me at a gym, appropriately enough. About 10 years ago, I was at a gym and mounted a Stairmaster, my cardio machine of choice, kind of old school cardio. And still remember to this day, just punching in my program, fat burner, 25 minutes, can't remember the level, put down my water and my towel. And for some reason I paused and I looked out at the gym floor, all these people, men and women, doing bench presses, using dumbbells, chin-ups, pull-ups, Bosu ball, yoga. And I just paused and thought, how did we all end up here in gyms? And if I were to trace a line backward in time, where would I land? And I literally got off the Stairmaster, went to the library, and just thought I would find a book on the history of exercise that would answer that question. And I didn't. And a kind of light bulb went on, or light bulb went off, whatever the phrase is. And I thought that could be a great topic for a book. But it did take me a couple of years before I really got myself started on the book, and went back to another library here in New York, a beautiful library for medical professionals primarily, called the New York Academy of Medicine. And it was there in the rare books room that a librarian introduced me to Girolamo Mercuriale. who is otherwise pretty obscure and unknown to most people, a 16th century physician who was living in Rome, personal physician to a cardinal, a prominent and prestigious and wealthy cardinal, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. And in this position, he had access to the Vatican Library and the Farnese family library, and he began deciphering, translating, reading, studying ancient Greek and Roman texts on health, the body, and exercise. And this was during the Renaissance, of course. There was already an interest in antiquity and the thinkers and physicians of that period. And it really was Mercuriale's aim to, as he said, revive the ancient Greek art of exercise. And he wrote the first comprehensive and also illustrated book on exercise. It's called De Arte Gymnastica. And as I said, I would never have known about it, probably, had it not been for a very wise librarian who said, surely you must know about Girolamo Mercuriale. And I said, no, actually, I've never heard of him. And she said, hold on a second. And she went back into the storage room and came back wearing white gloves and carrying a pristine first edition from 1569 of De Arte Gymnastica. And I then had to put on white gloves myself. These books are very rare. And I happened to open it up to an illustration, a woodcut engraving of two men wrestling, sort of like the cover of my book, actually, but by a different artist. And I was immediately captivated. There was something so bold and vivid about this illustration. So I anxiously turned the page, and then to my surprise, found that the entire book, the entire tome, which was very big, was written in medieval Latin. And I don't read Latin, couldn't read a word, but I was pretty sure I could make out the Latin word for exercise. And I was just so intrigued. And from there, I tracked down an English translation of De Arte Gymnastica, and eventually the translator himself, and sort of launched myself on a journey to retrace Mercuriale's footsteps, what led him to write this book, more about his whole life, as well as the whole history of exercise from antiquity to the present day.
It's funny, it's an obscure reference, but you compare him to Enoch Soames, which some of our readers might know, but I always loved that short story. And it really gave me an idea of who he was and how we remember or don't remember him.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated. I always have been by these figures who have an impact, but are kind of lost to history. So it runs through my 4 books that deal with aspects of medical or scientific history. My first book, Sleep Demons, I wrote about a prominent but otherwise obscure sleep scientist named Nathaniel Kleitman. In my book, 5 Quarts, which is about the history of human blood, I wrote about Paul Ehrlich, a blood scientist, important, but otherwise pretty obscure. And in this case, Mercuriale, who I think he thought he would be sort of the Hippocrates of his day. He was a brilliant physician, and he did go on to write a number of other books, not just about exercise, what is considered one of the first books on dermatology, for example, and obstetrics and other things. But in part because he did write in medieval Latin, and he did not have a full, accurate understanding of the workings of the human body, which I'm sure we'll talk about. His work and his contributions were sort of obscured, except for the academics and scholars. So I tried to sort of bring him to life in Sweat.
You know, one of the things, this is off topic, which I tend to do, but one of the things that fascinated me was how, I know from his writings and from your writings what an avid swimmer Dr. Sachs was, and you've become an avid swimmer. And I thought, he's writing a book about sweat, but he's swimming and you're not sweating. So then I thought, maybe I'm wrong. And I looked it up, and you actually are sweating.
Yeah, you are. We are pretty much always sweating as human beings, to be honest. You're sweating even when you don't realize it. And I've certainly experienced the sensation of swimming really hard, fast, and feeling that sensation of what happens with sweating or perspiration is the main function is thermoregulation. So your body overheats, and then this watery, slightly salty fluid comes through the millions of pores on your skin, and there's evaporative cooling, which cools down your body temperature. So yeah, you can even experience that while swimming in a pool or a lake. But we are always kind of sweating. It's part of the basic function of the human body.
It's so amazing that there's so much that the human body does that, even though I don't really believe it, it almost wants you to believe in intelligent design, because it's like, how in God's name literally, could this happen? You know, it's also, it's like, okay, well, let's do it this way. Mm-hmm. You titled it, so I feel comfortable asking the question. Mm-hmm. When you go after sweat on, say, Wikipedia, it comes up with perspiration, which you call it several times in the book. Mm-hmm. But why don't you did mention the thermoregulation, mm-hmm. but talk about the instances when we sweat. And the very interesting thing is the physiological reasons why we sweat. And then, as you discussed, the emotional.
Right.
And where that sweat comes out of.
Right. Well, sweating was a, evolutionary adaptation, survival mechanism for human beings, sort of baked into us from millions of years ago. There are two kinds of sweating. One is thermoregulation. As I said, your body overheats, and it really begins in the brain, the autonomic nervous system sensing that the body's overheating, and sends a message somehow throughout the body to sweat. And it's a really ingenious, simple way to cool down the body. I find there is a misconception about sweating. A lot of people think the sole purpose is what might be called detox, sweating out the toxins. You hear people talk about that, whether exercising or going into a sauna to sweat out the toxins. And while there is a little bit of that takes place, the truth is there are other organs of the human body that really are responsible for detox or filtering out toxins, namely the kidney and the liver. So there is thermoregulation, and then there's something called emotional sweating. And that's sweating that happens under extreme emotional states, whether positive or negative. Fear, ecstasy, anger, and it probably evolved as an adaptation in early hominids as a kind of signaling device. There are only a few places on the body that what's called emotional sweating occurs: your forehead, your armpits, your palms. I mean, a good example is like stage fright, like suddenly having, one of the biggest fears people have is with public speaking. And people will often, if they get very anxious and terrified, will just break out into a sweat on their forehead and, so forth. And it's also true that both can occur at the same time. Your body can get overheated and you can be terrified and just become drenched in sweat. There are two different kinds of sweat glands. The most common and frequent is the eccrine gland. And we're actually born as babies with as many pores in the body as we have today. So I have as many pores in my body as I did right after I was born. And emotional sweating is part of the apocrine gland, which is sort of more responsible for the sometimes funky smelling odor of sweat. And yeah, with babies, you may see them just after they're born and they break into a cry and sweat appears on their foreheads and the soles and palms and so forth.
Yeah, one of the secondary purposes that you discuss, and I would never thought of that, is the idea of one hominid seeing sweat on a forehead and recognizing that that person feels as if he's in danger, and the other one is that the stickiness, if you will, of sweat. It reminds me of the division rounds of the football this year, when they make one-handed catches, but they have
Yeah.
these gloves that I don't know why they let them wear these gloves. They're incredibly tacky. And that's the kind of thing you're talking about, right?
Yeah, it is. It's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. And that evolved with early hominids as we became bipedal and walked and eventually adapted to running, shed our primate-like hairy coats, that sweating evolved to keep us cool, but also to communicate states of being, you might say, states of fear or running for one's life or danger. Yeah, so it's definitely a survival mechanism. It's not just to quote unquote detox or sweat out toxins.
Yeah, it's funny how I think you mentioned it, or maybe I read it elsewhere. It's funny how dogs don't sweat because they use their tongues and their mouth to get rid of but horses sweat copiously.
Yeah, and Charles Darwin wrote about that.
But that's where I saw it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And hippopotamuses, I hope I'm saying that right. Or is it hippopotami? I'm not sure.
I think it's S now. I think it's like, it's like Pluto being a moon or not a moon.
Yeah. They sweat, I believe, with a kind of red color to it as well.
Yeah.
Another, kind of amazing, surprising detail I discovered about sweat was that in antiquity, in ancient Greece and Rome, the sweat of athletes was considered a prized commodity. It was believed that the sweat of supreme athletes must contain the essence of arete, as they called it, excellence. So really, in a certain way, like the better the athlete, the more powerful the sweat. And they developed or created a special tool for scraping the sweat off the body. It's called a strigil, and it's shaped sort of like a celery stalk. And they would scrape the sweat and oil off their bodies and funnel it into little clay pots. And this mixture of sweat and oil, probably very funky smelling, one can assume, was called gloios. And gloios was sold in those little clay pots at gymnasiums in ancient Greece. But, one might think gloios would be used to make you a better athlete or to run faster or to be able to lift more like those athletes. But instead, gloios was used by doctors as a kind of dermatological treatment, to put it very diplomatically, to be used to cure warts or hemorrhoids. So,
it's I wanted to talk. We will talk about the four humors, but I remember you talking about how you used your hand as the instrument. So this is a good story about how because Dr. Sachs lived in a place where there weren't any neighbors close by, and how you thought, oh, wait a minute, let's see how this works. And you ran up and down with your shorts on and your sneakers. And then you took off everything except for your sneakers. Right. And if you want to talk about what happened down there, that's interesting, but you may not want to talk about it. But just talk about why you did that.
Yeah, the book, it is a history of exercise from antiquity up through the present day. It's also the story of Girolamo Mercuriale. But in a certain way, the book is also a chronicle of my own history of exercise as I try out different forms of exercise, walking, running, swimming, boxing, or recall moments when I did those exercises. In writing and thinking about the ancient Greeks and athletic competition, I was thinking about the fact that they exercised and competed in the nude. And we're talking about men only at this period. And in fact, the word gymnastics comes from a Greek word that means exercising naked. So gymnastics, and the title of Mercuriale's book, De Arte Gymnastica, really does mean exercising in the nude. And of course, you go to museums like the Met or any major museum and you see ancient Greek vases or amphorae with depictions of clearly naked men competing, wrestling, boxing, doing kind of the ancient Greek version of mixed martial arts. And it suddenly hit me one day, was that really true? how did that work exactly? And did they really compete, boxing and running in the nude? And I thought, I've got to put this to the test. So in my chapter on running, I try it out. And yeah, Oliver had a home in the country with a really long driveway. It was a private, sort of fenced in area. So no one was there to witness my crazy experiment. But yeah, I did a test run with my shorts on and t-shirt. Then I stripped everything off and ran the quarter mile back and forth up and down the driveway. And I found that something very amazing occurred. I call it nature's own jockstrap, so that my testicles immediately retracted, my scrotum, my penis, it all just sort of like, almost like a message from my brain, like, pack it up, boys. And I was able to run quite easily just with a little bit of bouncing, we shall say. And it sort of like proved to me, like, I can see how ancient Greek runners sprinted in the nude, boxed, did marathons even. Just had to see how that worked. And it wasn't a scientific experiment, more like a personal experiment.
It's like the corollary of women wearing sports bras, so they don't do the same. It also reminds me of an airplane retracting its gear as it goes up, because it has to.
That's a good metaphor. Yeah, everything got retracted and I was able to run quite freely. And yeah, it's one of a number of fun anecdotes in this book as I sort of chronicle my journey in tracing the history of exercise.
You may very well get me in trouble because I have a long driveway too, but I do have neighbors. But I'm going to do it.
You should try it. You should try it.
Yeah, but yours wasn't dangerous. Mine has the possibility of it would only be a misdemeanor, but
yeah, I'm surprised more people don't do it, actually. But I mean, the same is true with skinny dipping, I guess. Everything retracts. It's sort of like everything connects, everything retracts.
It's like that episode of Seinfeld where George goes in the water,
Right.
He goes, wait a minute, shrinkage.
I remember that. It's great. Well, the human body is an amazing thing. I wrote a book called The Anatomist as well, which is actually how Oliver and I met. It was my third book. The Anatomist tells the story behind Gray's Anatomy, the classic 19th century anatomy text. And it's been in print since 1875 when it was first published. And I've had a copy since I was in college. Like a lot of people picked it up at a used bookstore. It's very common with doctors, of course, or med students, and also artists because of the copious and beautiful anatomical illustrations. And one day I needed to look up something in Gray's Anatomy, just a reference. And it suddenly occurred to me, again, like Mercuriale, like, who was Gray? Who was the Gray behind Gray's Anatomy? And there was a man named Henry Gray. So I made the effort to sort of uncover his life story. And in the process, I wanted to learn enough about anatomy that I could write about it knowledgeably. So I audited for a year anatomy courses alongside medical students at UCSF in San Francisco, and ended up doing full cadaver dissection and really getting a feel for what the actual Henry Gray had done so many years ago. And this, in a coincidence, this is how I met my partner, Oliver Sacks. He grew up in a family of doctors. Both of his parents were physicians. His two older brothers were doctors. So there was a copy of Gray's Anatomy in their household since he was a boy. And he picked up my book, The Anatomist, just to learn about the story behind Gray's Anatomy. He read it and he wrote me a letter out of the blue. I didn't know him, but of course I knew his work, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and Anthropologist on Mars, and Awakenings, and other books. And he just wrote a very collegial letter saying, "Dear Mr. Hayes, I read your book, The Anatomist, congratulations." And it's very collegial. And I was blown away because I used to read his profiles in the New Yorker and so forth. And so I wrote a letter back and said, thank you. And then to my surprise, he wrote a letter back to me. So we had a brief correspondence. And then when I ended up moving to New York City, from San Francisco, it didn't have to do with Oliver. It was a separate decision. But once I moved here, we started to see each other and get to know each other, and became partners.
It's interesting you say it as an aside, but I think about it a lot, about the epistolary beginning of your relationship as if it was out of Jane Austen or something like that.
Yeah.
And you do talk about how no one does that anymore. I do. If there's something very important, for some reason, I tend to actually write a letter. Do you ever do that?
It's very rare now, to be honest. I used to write letters all the time. Yeah, I mean, I suppose one could argue that email is the modern equivalent to writing letters, but there's something very different about getting a handwritten letter in the mail. There was something very 19th century about Oliver his whole life. Actually, he wrote with fountain pens. He wrote his books in longhand with a fountain pen. This was his apartment where I am right now. And it may be hard for people to believe, but when Oliver was alive and working and writing, there was no technology in this apartment at all. He never owned or worked on a computer or word processor, as we called it back in the day. Yeah, no Wi-Fi in this apartment, no cell phone, really almost like, I used to tease him, almost like from the 19th century or from another time. I have to say, he did, just so people know, he did have an assistant or a couple of assistants who had an office elsewhere, and they would transcribe Oliver's handwritten manuscripts into for a computer. And if people send him email, they could send email back for him.
Yeah, I've known attorneys who still do that. I also like the fact that he knew nothing about modern culture, if you will, popular music or arts. And I love the way he called your phone your communicator.
Oliver just didn't have the vocabulary for the digital age. He was a brilliant man. He was a genius. So I think he understood, basic concepts about how the internet worked. And he understood that his assistant could get research for him off the internet. But it was not something he was ever interested in pursuing for himself. Perfectly happy to write in longhand on yellow legal pads. And he would call, I had a cell phone, of course, and he would call it, he couldn't remember like what it was called. He did not like calling phones iPhones, because he said, that's a brand. That's not the name for a communicator. It was like something out of Star Trek to him. Yeah. So he called it your communicator. Can you look up a definition of a word on your communicator there? But yeah, he was not on social media or anything like that. But no, this was one of the delights and beauties of living with Oliver. It was really a life of the mind, and of reading and writing and music, and for me, photography. I became a photographer when I moved to New York. So yeah, much quieter kind of existence, but also full of conversation and music and energy.
Yeah, if the Russians knocked down our internet like they're doing in the Ukraine, Dr. Sachs he wouldn't lose anything, but you and I would go insane.
Yeah, that's really true. No, he would be perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. The most advanced technology he had in this apartment was a Bose radio in every room in the apartment, even the bathrooms, and listen to classical music. The classical music station in New York is WQXR, and his favorite thing was to have all the radios playing WQXR at the same time. So the apartment was just filled with music, with classical music, his favorite being Bach. And so that's a very sweet memory I have of Oliver.
Yeah, it's very interesting how, if you go back to, it's funny, but if you go to Wikipedia or you go to Oliver Sacks' images, when you see the images, it almost is a timeline of his entire life. You know what I mean? Like leaning against the motorcycle, Muscle Beach, and then when he looks somewhat avuncular, and then like more like a Socrates at the end, It's fascinating.
In the spring of 2015, the year that he got his terminal cancer diagnosis, he died in August 2015, he published his memoir On the Move, which was the first time Oliver wrote publicly about his personal life, including his relationship with me and his being gay, but also about his early life in San Francisco and LA, where he was this kind of leather wearing hot motorcycle stud. And the cover of that book, On the Move, shows a photo that really surprised a lot of people. The Oliver Sacks, they thought they knew, this kind of avuncular, eccentric, brilliant, bearded man, actually started out looking like, Marlon Brando in the 1960s. And he really got a kick out of that. How it sort of subverted people's impressions of Oliver Sacks. And the story he tells about his life in that amazing book, which is so candid and so beautifully written, I think has really surprised people. People love that book. And it was really important for him to see that published before he died. He died just a few months later.
Yeah, and I read it this day it came out. It's funny you mentioned Marlon Brando, because that reminds me of Tennessee Williams, which reminds me of how there's so many like regular people who say things about, well, go ahead, tell that one quote about, I'm ashamed of,
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
When you're talking about Tennessee Williams and I don't know, but is it A Streetcar Named Desire, where he says,
oh, right. Yeah. Gosh, I don't know if I can say it exactly. I'm sorry. Mitch talks about being ashamed of sweating, of perspiring. And I guess Blanche, she says, it's perfectly normal, it's perfectly healthy. If you didn't sweat, you'd die in 5 minutes. And she was exactly right. I mean, sweating really does keep us alive. We would not survive without that.
It's also amazing that I don't think people would understand until reading your book, if they haven't discovered it otherwise, that you can actually sweat out 1 liter or 2 liters in an hour with vigorous exercise. I mean, that's a lot of water.
Yeah, which means you're really, really, really overheating and exercising really hard, burning a lot of calories, literally burning calories. Yeah, it's related to metabolism.
Let's go back to selling your book. I always go aside and
That's all right. It's fun.
So talk about the 4 humors, because they were still being used as the basis for lots of medical treatment in the 17th and 18th century.
Yeah. Well, the theory of the 4 humors goes back to antiquity, to Hippocrates in the 5th century BC, Galen, especially Galen in the 2nd century AD, the Roman physician. There was a belief up until the 17th century, so for many centuries, that the human body was composed of 4 humors, liquids really: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. And the belief was that these 4 humors had to be kept in balance, or in a kind of equilibrium. If one or more of them was thrown out of balance, the body would go into a state of distemper, which resulted in illness. And this is where primitive treatments like bloodletting and purging came from this belief in the 4 humors. Now, why would they think this? I mean, one of the powerful reasons is that dissection of human bodies, cadavers, was forbidden for centuries. So even brilliant physicians like Hippocrates or Galen didn't have that glimpse, that view into the body that someone like Henry Gray had, or in the 19th century, or that I had in the 21st. It wasn't until William Harvey in the 17th century discovered the circulation of blood by the beat of the heart, and proved this through indisputable scientific evidence, that it was known exactly how we work as human beings, with the heart being the most important organ and responsible for the circulation of the blood, and that there weren't 4 mysterious humors circulating within the body. So even Hippocrates and even Mercuriale in the 16th century, the book we've been talking about, his book, the Arte Gymnastica, though it is sensible in lots of ways in the advice he offers about exercise, as he goes through every form of exercise known at that time, it's all in the context of the 4 humors. So although his advice might be sensible, it's also based on a completely unscientific, inaccurate view of the body. So the humors come up again and again in De Arte Gymnastica, his book, whether he's talking about running or swimming or boxing.
That reminded me, the bibliography of this book is almost enough to learn a great deal about sweat. And then the index, and you don't see indices anymore, is also really enjoyable, which then reminds me of the third leg of a tripod, I guess, which would be your travel. I mean, your research is incredibly copious and must have been a great deal of fun. But then, talk a little bit about your travels to different places. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, the book, as I said, sort of chronicles my own journey in retracing Mercuriale's footsteps and the history of exercise. I got a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in 2013, so a long time ago, to begin working on this book. And it was a great, great gift. I'm so indebted to the Guggenheim Foundation. I had proposed this book as my project, and I used it primarily to travel. But with no master plan, I have to say, Sam, there was no master plan. I was really kind of following my gut or my nose as if I were a beagle, and going off to Italy when I needed to find something or experience something. And in the course of the book, I go to London, to Paris, several trips to Italy. I suddenly get on a plane and go to Stockholm, Sweden to learn about 19th century innovations in exercise. There were some very important figures there. To India, but also within the United States, I found a kind of trove of Mercuriale manuscripts that very few people have known about at an archive in Kansas City, Kansas. So everywhere from Kansas City, Kansas to Mumbai, to Rome, to Padua, where Mercuriale taught. And I just really, that's kind of how I've lived my life and how I've written my books and done my photography, just kind of following my gut and my interests and taking those chances. So that's also a part of this journey through the history of exercise.
Which reminds me, I've interviewed so many authors lately, who have written their book and it may almost be done, but then they have to go into the fact that we were living as you were in the pandemic.
Yeah.
And you mention it, you talk about it and compare it to HIV and the way people are perceived. And so how did you go? I don't know how any author goes about doing that. You know what your book's about, you've written it, and then then this thing happens. Mm-hmm. And it's not like you're writing a book about COVID or taking advantage of the pandemic, but you have to include it,
Yeah, I mean, I had written a great deal. I thought I was almost finished with this book before the pandemic. But that changed things. And I had to bring it up to the present day because the pandemic really had an impact on how people around the world exercise, literally, when the first lockdown came and gyms closed all around the entire world. So for those of us for whom the gym is where we work out or love to work out, or it's an aspect of our social life even, it was suddenly like cold turkey. And we adapted, and as a writer and sort of cultural historian, it was amazing to see how quickly all of us, or some of us, I should say, adapted in one way or the other to exercising at home. I came up with my own home exercise routine, very simple body weight exercises like push-ups, have a chin-up bar, doing some yoga, a little bit of yoga, sit-ups, and going for walks every day. And then, of course, a lot of people, I wasn't one of them, but a lot of people realized they could follow trainers and yoga teachers on YouTube or Instagram Live. And so these social media became a part of sort of replacing the gym and replacing that group fitness instructor that you would go to, and you could do it in your own home. The other thing I found so fascinating that I observed here in New York City is how intuitively, spontaneously, naturally, people gathered in public places to exercise. So the gyms may have been closed, and yet even so, people would gather there's a kind of grassy pier near where I live in the West Village. When I would take those walks in the early lockdown, seeing people exercise at that time, 6 feet social distancing, and sometimes there were spontaneous or organized group classes, aerobics style or yoga classes, but also just people kind of naturally wanting to come together and exercising individually, but in a public space. And I think what that speaks to is the kind of social aspect of exercising, that it's not always a completely solitary pursuit, but there is something social that feeds us in going to gyms or in exercising together.
Yeah, it reminded me again of the Greeks, because there was the social aspect, and in an amphitheater or a marathon or wrestling, for example, you are intimately involved with the person as well as the sweat. And it's funny too, because I've had a personal trainer for 20 years, maybe more, and I have no discipline at all. And the only reason I have been able to do this is because I feel like if I don't go, I'm disappointing my trainer. It's the only way I can do it.
That's a good incentive. Yeah, I think people are surprised to learn that there were gyms in virtually every town in the Greek Empire. So it wasn't just athletic festivals or athletic competitions like at Olympia, but there were gyms in virtually every town. I should emphasize again, gyms were at that time only for men and boys. Women and girls were not permitted or encouraged to exercise or compete in the athletic competitions, but there was definitely a social aspect to those gymnasiums as well. And it really is true that philosophers gathered there. That was part of going to the gym, to talk and discuss. Another fun fact I discovered, that Plato, who advocated exercise and exercising moderately, daily, working it into your daily life, Plato had himself been a competitive wrestler as a young man. And he competed at one of the 4 major athletic festivals. We all know about the Olympics, which are going on now, which literally took place at Olympia. But there were 3 other sites in Greece where there were athletic festivals in between. So Isthmia, Nemea, and Delphi were the 3 other sites. And Plato competed as a wrestler at Isthmia. And his given name was Aristocles. That's the name he was born with. But it was his wrestling coach, it is said, who gave him the nickname Plato, coming from the Greek word Platon for broad-shouldered. And Plato was sort of a shortening or nickname of broad-shouldered, because apparently he was a broad-shouldered wrestler. And that's one of many fun facts I discovered.
Yeah, speaking of fun facts, even though obviously, like from the bibliography, like I said,
Yeah.
and your travel, all the sources you rely on, and then tell us afterwards, how did you find things that Einstein or Madame Curie or Kafka did or said? I mean, it just seems I would never think Kafka would, he's miserable. He's in his garret with his plane table writing overnight Metamorphosis. So where does the sweat come in?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the book is sort of riddled with these little facts about other figures who didn't contribute to the history of exercise, but picturing them exercising. Albert Einstein on his bike. That's such an iconic photograph that so many of us are familiar with. Or learning that, that Kafka every night would wrestle with his next door neighbor where he lived. And he was a complete stranger, apparently, the neighbor, but he would come over every night and they would just have a wrestling match. And that was his exercise for the day. How did I come upon these? Well, a couple things. It's almost like when I told you about seeing Mercuriale's book for the first time. I couldn't read the Latin, but I was pretty sure I recognized the Latin word for exercise, exercitatio. So once I had the idea for this book in my mind, it was like I would see exercise in unexpected places. So just in my own reading for enjoyment. And Yeah, I was reading the Diaries of Franz Kafka, just for my own pleasure. I didn't go to it thinking, I'm going to find anything about exercise in here. I just happened to be reading it. And here there was an entry from May 1914 where he wrote about wrestling with his neighbor, and this was his form of exercise. Sometimes I have to say Oliver would suggest things to me. You know, I really began working seriously on this book in 2013. He died in 2015, but he would come across things in his own reading. So it was Oliver who told me that Marie Curie and her husband loved to bicycle and to hike. And that prior to her most important discovery, she and her husband Pierre had been hiking and bicycling and sort of had this period of recreation and leisure and exercise that perhaps sort of freed her mind, unscrambled things, and she was able to come back and make this important discovery. Yeah, so it was fun just to sort of sprinkle the book with these obscure facts. And to think about someone like Einstein, you know, that iconic picture of him riding a bike, I had seen that hundreds or thousands of times in my life. And one day it appeared in the New York Times newspaper about something. I actually can't even recall what it was for. And I tore out the picture and pinned it above my desk. And then I began going through biographies of Einstein. Of course, there are many, many, and trying to find out more about whether he bicycled a lot, if he owned a bike, was that bike his? I didn't find a final answer to that, but I did find that he loved to sail, which suggested to me that he probably knew how to swim. And so it just gave me a different view of Einstein. Yeah.
Well, I guess maybe in closing, and I know you've been asked this question, and when you go on tour, virtual or not, you'll be asked it again. And it's, you know, the usual Terry Gross question: what do you want readers to take away from this book? And as you said in one interview, you're not proselytizing. You're not, today's word, you're not shaming people who aren't exercising. But I think personally, and actually, I've done it. I was doing it before, increasing it, and now this, you know, kind of fortifies it, is what you described as the ideal form of exercise. And I think that's what people could take away, because it's not killing you. It's not hard to do. It's a beautiful thing to do with your dog, with your partner, whoever.
Yeah, I try to tell people who ask me about how do you get motivated to exercise, because it's true, a lot of us do dread exercise or hate exercise or don't want to do it, even though it's been proven to improve your health and lengthen your lifespan. I tell people to think of exercise as synonymous with movement, any kind of movement. So it's not that you have to go to a gym or go to an intense yoga class necessarily, or learn how to box like I did for this book, but just move your body. That could be dancing in your apartment, or it could be getting off your bus 3 stops early, or getting off the subway 3 stops early and walking the rest of the way home. Walking was advocated by Hippocrates and Plato as probably the ideal form of exercise. And although it's true that exercise may extend your life and help you to lose weight and other things, I really say to people, exercise for how it makes you feel now, right now, in your body. Pay attention. You know, how does it make you feel in your body, about your life, and find some form of exercise or some form of vigorous movement, as Mercuriale called it, that you enjoy. Because it could be going to the park and playing with your kids, or taking your dog for a brisk walk, or walking with a friend. It doesn't have to be something you dread. It doesn't have to be something regimented. It can be something just folded into your daily life. And you may, if you really think about it, you may realize you're exercising more than you even thought. So you can give yourself credit, you know. If you walk to work, there's your exercise for the day.
Yeah, I was just talking to someone about that. And it's, you know, in the context I was talking about was, even though I can only do it a couple times a day, the idea of living in the moment. And
yeah,
it's like Warren Zevon saying, enjoy every sandwich. And
yeah, that's great.
and so I think in addition to everything you're saying, and you've touched on it in this past answer, is the fact that when you're doing this, it's like wax on, wax off.
Yeah.
When you're doing this, that's all you're doing. Like your therapist might say, go home and wash your car. Don't, forget about anxiety, worry, regret, guilt, and you definitely, you answered just a minute ago, but I think that may be the most important thing that someone can take away from this.
Yeah. And to really appreciate what your body is capable of doing. My book Sweat actually opens with a chapter called Plunge, and the opening scene has me plunging into a very cold mountain lake in upstate New York. This was in October several years ago. And the water was something like 50 degrees, but it was a beautiful fall day in the Adirondacks. The lake looked pristine. Of course, there wasn't anyone else swimming, but I just couldn't resist. And I stripped off my clothes and plunged into the lake and swam, as far as I could without, completely losing my breath, and crawled back onto the dock. And later, some friends were just kind of taken aback and amazed. And they said, why would you do that? Why would you do that? Swim in that lake? And my answer was, because I can. Not in a bragging way, but because I can experience that. Experience what it's like. I'm healthy. I know how to swim. I want to see what it feels like in the moment. And it was exhilarating. And as I got out of the water and warmed up in the sun, I'd never felt better. That's how it should be.
Yeah, it's like yours was a little tougher, but if someone has a fear, say a simple fear, I don't want to walk over this curb. This curb really scares me. You can either do it. It may be the easiest thing in the world to do, and it may be the hardest thing to do at the same time.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you explained that very well. And that story does as well too.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I could ask question after question, because just from the quotes and the index and the bibliography. And so thanks. So where do I put this book in my bookstore? Do I put it in self-help? Do I put it in sports? Tell me where I should put it. It's on the front table now and in the window. But when I file it, where do I put it?
Well, you tell me, what does your gut tell you?
Well, you do memoir, but this is not memoir, even though you're in there a lot, and Dr. Sachs is in there a lot. And I don't want to put it in health. And I don't want to put it in, I hate self-help books. And it's not fiction. I'll have to ask my manager, because she's smarter than me. I don't know.
I'd say general nonfiction or memoir. I mean, there is a memoir woven into it, but I should also say there is a lot of history. I mean, it's based upon original research I did over many years into the history of exercise.
I think I'll put it in science.
Okay, it's a deal.
Okay. Hopefully you'll come by the bookstore and see it there sometime.
I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. This was great. I enjoyed it.
You too.
See ya.